The stars above seemed to flicker in distant constellations, galaxies too far to touch, too far to reach. But in this moment, the darkness of space had collapsed, bringing with it the harsh bite of survival. Frank Mercer awoke, groggy, his body bruised and aching. He didn't know how much time had passed, only that the world around him was no longer the familiar hum of his ship, but the cold silence of an alien jungle. Frank's eyelids fluttered open with a jolt, his senses assaulted by an explosion of pain that radiated from his wrists and ankles, shooting through every fiber of his body. His limbs were immobile, bound by some kind of unyielding force that restricted him, leaving him vulnerable. A primal surge of panic rushed through him, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled against the restraints. His thoughts scrambled, desperately trying to process the situation. What had happened? Where was he? His mind raced as the memories flooded back. The last thing he could remember was the sound of alarms blaring in the cockpit, high-pitched and frantic as his ship hurtled through hyperspace. There had been a violent pull, an unseen force that had ripped through the very fabric of reality itself. He had tried to fight it, tried to wrest control back, but there had been nothing he could do. His vision had blurred, the metal groaning as it tore through the atmosphere. And then, the crash. A crash so brutal, it had shattered his bones, his consciousness, his sense of everything. Darkness had consumed him, dragging him into an oblivion that seemed endless. But now, here he was, wide awake in an alien world he couldn't even begin to comprehend. His pulse quickened as he tried to move, but his body felt sluggish, too weak to respond as it should. The bindings on his wrists dug into his skin, unyielding, and there was no immediate escape. As his mind grasped at the fleeting fragments of reality, a rustling sound in the distance tore his attention away. He tensed, instinctively bracing for whatever came next. Out of the thick, overgrown foliage, a figure materialized, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct against the otherworldly backdrop of alien plants that pulsed with strange luminescence, but then it stepped closer, and his breath hitched in shock. The woman was, unlike anything he had ever seen. She towered over him, impossibly tall, her body rippling with strength and confidence. Her skin was a deep, rich shade of violet, smooth as silk, almost glowing under the dim, eerie light that bathed the environment. There was something almost ethereal about her, a perfect harmony between the unnatural beauty of her form and the alien world that surrounded them. The light seemed to dance off her skin as if it were alive, alive in ways Frank could not even begin to understand. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was her eyes. Dark. Endless. Black holes in the fabric of reality. Those eyes locked onto him with a piercing intensity, drilling into him as if she could see every thought, every fear, every weakness. She was studying him, no, observing him. Her gaze was cold, calculating, and predatory. A predator sizing up its prey. Frank swallowed hard, trying to compose himself, but the sharp pain in his chest, the helplessness of his situation, made it nearly impossible. You tied me up. His voice was rough, dry from the air, from thirst, from fear. His throat ached as if he hadn't spoken in days. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her face, curling the corners of her lips in a way that was almost amused, but not in the way a person might smile at a joke. It was the smile of someone who already knew the answers. You survived, she replied, her voice rich and melodic, each word dripping with an underlying authority that sent a chill down Frank's spine. There was no warmth in her tone, only control, unshakable, unquestionable control. Frank tried to move again, tugging at the bindings that held him. His body was weak, sluggish, and each attempt to free himself felt like a slow, futile struggle. The pressure on his chest rose, the panic inside of him threatening to spiral out of control. Who are you? He rasped, heart pounding harder with each passing second. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the overwhelming sensation of danger gripped him like a vice. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curling ever so faintly. She tilted her head to one side, as if savoring the moment, and then, without a hint of hesitation, she spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. "You are not in a position to ask questions," she said, each word clear, final, and uncompromising. It was a statement, not a request. Her words hung in the air like a command, and Frank felt a chill ripple through him. He wasn't in control here, not at all. She wasn't just some strange alien he had encountered by chance. No, this woman was something far more dangerous. Something deliberate. Something that wanted him. The realization hit him like a cold wave crashing over his senses. Her eyes, those dark, infinite eyes, weren't just studying him, they were evaluating him. She wasn't here by accident. Frank wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been brought here for a reason. She had captured him. Bound him. And whatever that reason was, it wasn't good. Her gaze shifted, the cold intensity never leaving her features. She moved closer, each step purposeful, her eyes never leaving his. Frank tried to steady his breath, his mind racing to figure out his next move, but nothing could prepare him for what was coming. She wasn't just a captor. She wasn't just an enemy. Frank had no idea who or what she really was, but he could feel that her presence was far more significant than any confrontation he had ever faced before. The tension in the air grew thick, suffocating, and Frank's gut twisted in a way he couldn't quite understand. He had survived countless battles, but this felt different. This was no ordinary fight. This was something deeper. Something beyond what he had prepared for. And as she leaned in, her lips barely curling in an enigmatic smile, Frank knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The atmosphere around Frank thickened, the very air growing dense as the woman knew, the creature approached him. With each deliberate step, the tension between them intensified, and it wasn't just the fear creeping through his veins. It was something else, something primal, something far beyond the physical realm. The air was alive with an unseen force, drawing him in, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. It was as though the very space around him had been altered by her presence. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, some kind of residual shock from the crash or his current helplessness. But as she moved closer, he felt it more acutely. The warmth, unnatural, suffocating, poured from her like a thick, molten substance, pulling at him, crawling beneath his skin. He felt it before he understood it. This wasn't just an alien woman. This wasn't just a captor. She was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something powerful. "I must feed," she whispered, her voice like silk, but edged with something darker, something that churned in his gut. As she crouched beside him, her hand brushed lightly against his chest, sending a jolt of heat straight into his core. Frank's breath hitched. It wasn't just a touch, it was a shock. A blast of heat, like an electric current surging through his veins, a sensation that was foreign, utterly alien, but undeniable. Frank tried to shift away, tried to escape, but the bindings held him firmly, unrelenting. His heart raced, pulse pounding in his ears, as his mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what was happening. Her touch, so soft, yet it burned like fire, igniting every nerve in his body. It was a warmth that was both intoxicating and torturous. It coiled deep inside him, igniting something he had no control over. His muscles tightened, but not from resistance. No, this was something else. It was the heat that surrounded him, sinking deeper into his chest, into his soul. He clenched his jaw, fighting to retain control over himself, but it was slipping away, piece by piece. His body betrayed him. Every breath he took seemed to draw him further into her grasp. She leaned closer, her fingers tracing lightly down the curve of his ribs. The sensation was maddening. Every part of him screamed to pull away, to fight, to resist, but he couldn't. He was trapped, not just by the physical restraints, but by the very pull of her presence. It was like the bond between them was growing, an invisible thread wrapping around him, pulling tighter, drawing him into her orbit. "You will satisfy me," she murmured, her voice like honey, deep, rich, and layered with a hunger that sent a shiver down his spine. Her lips curled slightly, a small smile that wasn't comforting, but predatory. It was a promise, but one that sent an even deeper chill through Frank. Frank's heart hammered in his chest. He tried to jerk against the restraints, trying to break free, his teeth gritted in defiance. "I'm not your meal," he growled, the words barely escaping his throat, rough and ragged from the dryness of his mouth. His body screamed at him to fight, to break away from whatever this was, but every fiber of his being, every pulse in his veins, was already responding to her, to the bond forming between them. The woman, no, the creature did not flinch. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink, as if his defiance were nothing more than a fleeting nuisance. Her gaze held a dangerous amusement as her lips curled into a deeper, knowing smile. And then, in a voice that held a weight far beyond her words, she said softly, "You are something else entirely. You are mine." Frank's stomach twisted at the sound of those words, the force behind them like chains that wrapped around his very soul. Her words felt like a decree, a claim that had been made, one he couldn't escape, no matter how much he fought. But it wasn't just her words. No. It was the connection that had begun to form between them. It wasn't just her touch, her power, it was something deeper. A bond. Something that went beyond the physical. Something that seeped into him, into his mind, his heart, his very essence. He could feel it slowly wrapping itself around him, pulling him closer to her, pulling him toward whatever she was. His pulse raced. "What the hell are you doing to me?" His voice cracked, the question slipping from his lips in a way that was both filled with anger and confusion. The fight in him was faltering, wavering under the pressure of whatever it was she was doing to him. He couldn't even tell where his body ended and her influence began. She only smiled, watching him struggle with dark, almost cruel amusement. "You feel it, don't you?" Her voice was low, a purring whisper, laden with satisfaction. "The connection. It cannot be undone. Once it begins, it cannot stop." And just like that, the world around Frank seemed to tilt. He understood. He understood, at least in part, that this wasn't just a battle of wills or a struggle for survival. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. This wasn't just about escaping, about getting away. This wasn't a fight for his life, it was a fight for his very soul. His body, his thoughts, his autonomy, everything was slipping away under the weight of her power. This wasn't a simple captivity. This wasn't just some alien encounter. This was something insidious. Something that reached beyond the physical and into his very being. His survival wasn't just in question, it was becoming irrelevant. What she had begun wasn't about escape, it was about surrender. His body, his mind, even his will, was already starting to bend to her influence. Frank wasn't just a prisoner. He was becoming part of her world. Part of the hunger that bound them together. As the realization struck him, a deep, unsettling feeling settled in his chest. He was no longer just a man fighting to break free. He was a piece of something much larger, and that knowledge terrified him. The faint rustle of leaves broke the otherwise quiet stillness, a soft whisper that sent a cold shiver down Frank's spine. His senses, still heightened by the earlier surge of fear and adrenaline, snapped into overdrive. Every muscle in his body tensed, every nerve alight with anticipation. Something was out there. He wasn't alone. And whatever it was, whatever they weren't here for casual conversation. Frank strained against the restraints, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced, every possible scenario flashing in his thoughts. His body was still weak from the crash, his limbs sluggish, and though his mind screamed for him to act, the reality was he had no weapon, no defense, and no clear escape route. He was at the mercy of whatever forces this planet had to offer. Before he could even process what was happening, the alien woman the creature moved. It was an instantaneous shift, one that was so fluid it was almost unnatural. Her posture changed from that of a confident, seductive being to something far more dangerous, far more primal. She didn't need to say a word. The transformation in her body language spoke volumes. The playful smirk faded from her lips, replaced by an intense, focused gaze, her eyes scanning the horizon with a kind of predatory calm that made Frank's blood run cold. Without looking back at him, her voice came, low and resolute, breaking the silence. "They are coming." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. His throat tightened. "Who?" he asked, his voice ragged, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. She didn't hesitate, didn't need to explain herself further. "The hunters." The weight of her words settled over him, the meaning sinking in like a stone in water. It wasn't just about escape anymore. They weren't the ones in control. The ones who were coming were the hunters. And Frank, bound and vulnerable, was the prey. But worse than that, he was now tangled in the web of something far darker. It wasn't just the alien woman who posed a threat. He was being hunted, as though this whole ordeal had been carefully orchestrated for him to end up right here, right in the path of the predators. Frank's pulse raced even faster, each beat thumping against his chest like a warning. His mind screamed at him to move, to find a way out, but his body felt like lead. The bond with the alien woman was still affecting him, clouding his thoughts, making him feel tethered to her in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. A sound echoed through the jungle, distant at first but growing louder with every passing second. The crackling of the underbrush, the subtle rustle of branches moving as someone moved through the thick foliage. Frank's instincts kicked into high gear, sharpening his awareness. They were here. The trees shuddered, their bark creaking as if they, too, could sense the coming danger. Shadows moved swiftly between the towering alien flora, figures cloaked in the darkness. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He could feel them closing in. The air was thick with the scent of earth and vegetation, but beneath it all, there was a sharpness, a presence like a storm building just before the rain. It was coming fast. He wasn't prepared. Frank had faced enemies before, countless threats in his life, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting against something that seemed to sense every fear, every weakness he held within himself. And then, out of the murky shadows, they appeared. The first of the hunters stepped into view, clad in dark, sleek armor that blended seamlessly with the environment. The hunter's silhouette was almost unnaturally sharp, the contours of their form hidden beneath the reflective plating that seemed to absorb the dim light around them. Frank's blood ran cold as his gaze locked onto the figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything like what he had seen before. The armor was form-fitting, designed not just for protection but for stealth, and the weapons they carried glinted in the fading light like the promise of violence. More shadows emerged, the rest of the hunters following in swift formation. They moved with a practiced grace, their footsteps soundless on the thick undergrowth. Frank's gut twisted as they advanced, the unmistakable aura of trained killers hanging in the air. The cold, calculating intensity in their movements sent an electric jolt of terror through him. He was outnumbered. Outgunned. And worse, he had no idea who or what they were, but one thing was certain: they weren't here for a conversation. The woman, still standing beside him, didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her posture relaxed but taut with the kind of readiness that only a predator possessed. Frank could feel the pull of her presence beside him. She was, for lack of a better word, a force of nature, fierce and unyielding. But that didn't make Frank feel any less exposed. "Can we fight them?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice, but there was no real hope in the question. He had no weapon. No plan. And the bond between him and the alien woman was still far too strong, her overwhelming presence still casting its shadow over him. She turned slightly, her eyes flashing with a dangerous gleam, her lips curling ever so faintly. "We do not fight," she said, her tone a mix of grim satisfaction and cold detachment. "We survive." Her words hit Frank like a slap in the face. No fight. No resistance. She wasn't just leading him into danger, she was preparing him for something worse. Escape wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. And yet, as the hunters closed in, he could feel something else rising in him, something he hadn't expected. He wasn't just following her. He was becoming part of this, whatever this was. And if the hunters caught them, if they were taken alive. Frank shuddered at the thought. A low growl echoed through the air, followed by a voice, rough and guttural, spoken in a language Frank didn't understand. He tensed. The hunters weren't just closing in, they were hunting. Every movement was precise, calculated. They weren't here to capture, they were here to kill. And as the first shot rang out, narrowly missing Frank's shoulder, he realized just how badly he had underestimated the situation. The air was now crackling with danger, each second drawing them closer to a confrontation they were never prepared for. The jungle around Frank came alive with the sound of danger. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath heavy feet was a reminder that he wasn't alone, and the ones hunting him weren't just shadows, they were predators. The thick, humid air weighed down on him, his breath coming in sharp gasps as his senses heightened, each sound magnified, each movement a potential threat. His heart thundered in his chest, every beat a drum signaling the grim dance of survival that was about to unfold. Frank's pulse quickened, but despite his body's fight or flight instincts kicking in, there was no time to think. The enemy was near. He could feel the eyes of the hunters on him, could sense the shift in the air as they circled in. They were coming from all directions, fast, efficient, and deadly. But as the hunter approached, his movements swift and calculated, the woman Lyra was already ahead of him, her body moving like a shadow. Every step was a whisper, every motion as smooth as liquid metal. She was a predator herself, an apex force that had no equal in this jungle. Her eyes flickered with a predatory gleam, and in a flash, she disappeared into the undergrowth, blending seamlessly with the darkness. Her presence was everywhere. She wasn't just a companion. She was the storm that followed, the silent force that would strike when it was least expected. The battle was on. Frank wasn't accustomed to relying on others, not like this. He had always been a lone wolf, trusting only his instincts and his strength to carry him through the fight. But this time, he didn't have a choice. The weight of the situation hit him hard, and in that fleeting moment, he knew his survival depended on the partnership they would form reluctantly, but inevitably. The first hunter lunged at him, his armored figure a blur of motion, a flash of dark steel cutting through the air. Frank didn't hesitate. His instincts, honed through years of fighting, surged to the forefront, and he met the attack with brutal precision, his fist crashing into the hunter's abdomen, sending him stumbling backward. But the hunter wasn't just any soldier, he wasn't a novice. No, this one was trained, faster than Frank had anticipated. The hunter recovered in an instant, spinning with a grace that only someone who had spent years perfecting their craft could achieve. Frank barely had time to react before the hunter's blade flashed in front of him. It was a blur, a dangerous arc that would have sliced through his neck had he not ducked just in time. The cold steel passed inches from his face, and the wind of it left a searing trail along his cheek. His breath hitched, adrenaline spiking as he scrambled to regain his footing. The fight had just escalated from bad to worse, and Frank realized, with a sinking feeling, that every moment of this battle would count. The jungle around them seemed to respond to the chaos. Branches cracked, leaves rustled violently, and the deep thrum of battle echoed through the trees as Frank fought with all he had. But it wasn't just him anymore. Lyra was there everywhere. Her movements were fluid, effortless, like a dance of destruction. She was a deadly wraith, striking from the shadows, disarming her attackers with a swift grace that Frank couldn't help but admire. Each slash of her blade was calculated, precise, almost inhuman in its speed. Frank had seen many fighters in his time, but Lyra, she was something else entirely. He barely had time to process it before another hunter appeared from the shadows, coming at him with a low growl. Frank barely parried the blow before spinning out of the way, using the momentum to send a savage kick into the hunter's chest. But the jungle was chaotic now, and the battle had become a swirling mass of violence. Frank's heart raced in time with the strikes, every breath coming in ragged gasps as he parried, ducked, and blocked. He had to survive. He had to keep moving. But his focus was split. Not just on survival, but on Lyra. Every time their eyes met across the chaos of battle, Frank felt something shift between them. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore, it was something far more complex. Their bond, something Frank had never fully understood, grew stronger with each passing second. She wasn't just his ally. She wasn't just a partner in survival. No, she was becoming something far deeper, more integral to his very existence. Every glance, every shared moment in the thick of the fight, made him realize how intertwined their fates were. As the chaos around them swirled, Frank felt that strange connection, that pull, becoming more intense, almost suffocating. Her presence in his mind was undeniable now. It wasn't just physical proximity or shared danger, it was something else, something that ran far deeper than just the battle. Frank was aware of the way his body responded to her, an involuntary response, as though their fates were becoming entwined. She was more than just the key to his survival. She was his anchor in the storm. And the bond between them, it was undeniable. Unstoppable. But Frank wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse. They moved together, flowing as one, their movements synchronizing without a word, as though they had been fighting together for years. Frank's body ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, but the adrenaline and the connection to Lyra fueled him, driving him forward despite the overwhelming odds. The jungle felt like a maze, the hunters relentless, closing in with every passing second, but still, they fought. They pushed deeper into the jungle, moving toward the wreckage of Frank's ship, the one chance they had at escape. But time was running out. The hunters were everywhere, and Frank could feel the weight of their pursuit bearing down on him. Each step felt like it could be his last. The jungle around him, once so vibrant and alien, now felt like a cage, the dense foliage closing in as the relentless pursuit continued. The bond between him and Lyra wasn't just a tether, it was the key to everything. As much as Frank wanted to deny it, to focus solely on survival, he couldn't shake the feeling that his fate and hers was now bound together. This wasn't just a fight to escape, it was a battle for something far more complicated. And with every clash, every movement, Frank knew one thing with absolute certainty: they weren't just running from the hunters. They were running towards something much bigger. Something neither of them fully understood. But they had no choice. The wreckage of Frank's ship emerged from the thick jungle mist ahead, a broken carcass of metal and scorched hull, half buried in the alien terrain. The once pristine vessel that had been his pride, his sanctuary among the stars, now looked like a mangled husk, its body marked by the violent re-entry, 1,000 scars etched across its surface. The ship had survived the crash barely. The nose was crumpled, the wings twisted and half sunken into the soil, while parts of the fuselage were charred and twisted, as though the very atmosphere had torn into its skin. It was a miracle it had even remained intact. But miracles wouldn't be enough. Not now. Frank's heart pounded as he approached the wreckage, his mind racing at a breakneck speed, 1,000 thoughts colliding in an attempt to focus on the one thing that mattered. Could they fix it in time? The hunters were closing in. He could hear the sound of their footsteps in the distance, their rhythmic pounding in the dense underbrush, a reminder that time was no longer on his side. The jungle was alive with movement, and somewhere in the shadows, the hunters were watching, waiting. Every moment they spent here, exposed in the open, only made it more likely that the final confrontation was fast approaching. Frank pushed forward, his pulse quickening, even though his body was beginning to feel the strain of battle. His hands moved quickly over the damaged ship's control panels, stripping systems for parts, making do with whatever he could salvage. It was a frantic, desperate effort. Wires snipped, panels torn open, sparks flying as he rewired the core system with whatever he could find. His mind moved just as quickly as his hands, calculating, improvising, doing what he could to get the ship operational. Lyra, standing a few feet away, was a silent sentinel. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the jungle around them with an intensity that bordered on unnatural. Her posture was rigid, alert, as though she were attuned to every subtle movement in the foliage. The woman knew, the creature was a predator. And Frank felt a strange sense of comfort in the knowledge that she was by his side. If anyone could hold back the hunters, it was her. Still, there was no time for reassurance. No time to waste. It was now or never. The sounds of the jungle grew louder as the tension in the air thickened. Frank's focus sharpened, his body moving on instinct, trying to ignore the creeping sensation of dread in his gut. He knew they were out of time. Every second counted. His hands shook with the effort, sweat beading on his brow as he forced himself to keep working. And then finally a spark. The ship's thrusters roared to life with a loud, mechanical groan, the power surging through the systems. Frank felt it, the unmistakable hum of life returning to the vessel. For a moment, everything seemed possible again. His heart lifted, adrenaline coursing through him as he watched the flickering lights stabilize. The systems were coming online. But before he could allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief, the ground beneath him trembled. The sound of movement in the jungle grew more frantic, closer. The hunters weren't giving up that easily. A sharp cry split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. Frank's eyes darted toward the ship's loading ramp, where the first of the hunters emerged from the shadows. There were more of them, too many. Armed, relentless, and intent on stopping them from leaving. A final, brutal battle unfolded on the ship's loading ramp. The air thickened with tension as Frank and Lyra fought side by side, a deadly dance of survival. Weapons clashed with a ringing metallic sound, the flashes of blades illuminating the chaos. Frank moved with instinct, blocking a strike, spinning to deliver a crushing blow to a hunter's midsection. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every swing, every movement was a desperate attempt to buy more time, to delay the inevitable. Lyra was everywhere, her presence as deadly as it was graceful. She was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of steel and fury. Her strikes were swift, lethal, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. The hunters fell one by one as she cut through them with an elegance that seemed almost too perfect. But even she couldn't keep them all at bay. The jungle echoed with the cries of battle, the savage sounds of conflict. Frank's heart raced as he fought alongside her. There was no room for hesitation, no time for fear. They were outnumbered, but not outmatched, not with Lyra at his side. He could feel her presence, steady and powerful, as their movements synchronized, as if they had fought together their entire lives. They were a force, a storm of destruction, and yet, the hunters kept coming. Time was slipping away, the world around them a blur of flashing blades and gunfire. Frank could see the desperation in Lyra's eyes, the same desperation mirrored in his own. Every second they spent here, fighting for their lives, brought them closer to the point of no return. But just as the hunters surged forward again, The ship lurched into the air with a violent jolt, the jungle falling away beneath them. The sound of the thrusters screamed through the air, a deafening roar of power and freedom as the vessel broke through the canopy, rising into the sky. Frank's chest heaved with exertion, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the weight of the universe lift off his shoulders. They had made it. They were free. The ship soared higher, leaving the earth far behind. The thick, suffocating jungle was now nothing more than a distant memory, a fading blur beneath them as they ascended into the stars. Frank's eyes traced the horizon, watching as the expanse of space opened up before them, a vast canvas of infinite possibilities. The weight of the hunt, the struggle, the fight, it all seemed so far away now. But even as they left the planet behind, Frank couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Something deep inside told him that their journey was just beginning, that the stars stretched ahead of them not as a destination but as a warning. Their fight for survival had only set them on a path towards something greater and far more dangerous. And as the ship streaked through the black, vast expanse of space, Frank looked over at Lyra, her eyes still fierce, yet calm now. For the first time, they were alone. Not in the jungle. Not in the fight. But in the endless unknown of the stars. Their fate was no longer something determined by the chase or the hunters that followed them. It was something more. And Frank had no idea what was waiting for them ahead. But as the stars stretched out before him, he knew one thing with certainty: whatever came next, they would face it together. As the stars streaked past, the hum of the ship now a comforting presence, Frank turned to Lyra. Her sharp features softened as she gazed out the window, the tension of their escape slowly melting away. But even as they left the planet behind, the bond between them lingered. Frank had once been a man who thrived on control, on independence. But now, as he looked at Lyra, he knew there was no going back. Whatever this connection was, whatever force had drawn them together, it was stronger than anything he had ever known. And for the first time, Frank was okay with that. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt he was exactly where he needed to be.